Hello, and welcome to week 5, coming to you from a new location. Hopefully, everyone's doing well and enjoying the course so far. This week, we're going to be talking about what is education for peace. Okay, so what are the skills, values, and behaviors that humans need to live in cultures of peace? So, in today's plan, the overview includes defining basically what is education for peace, what are values and skills that might be included, do some reflections on values learning, worldview creation, and then talk about nonviolent communication. And at the end there, I'm just going to add a few reflections from Castro's training manual as well that I think are important. So, education for peace, basically value, skills, behaviors, techniques that we need to live in a sustainable, peaceful world, right? These are usually best learned through practice. Unlike education about peace that we talked about last week, this is the stuff that you need to practice. Usually just reading about it won't help you develop these techniques or skills, right? So in terms of values, or sometimes you can think of them as skills as well, we might include nonviolence, empathy, integrity, and when we think about skills, we're thinking about nonviolent conflict transformation, critical thinking, responsible citizenship. Okay. So there are some examples, and I'd like you to take a minute and think for yourself. Yay! So, what values do you think are important in education for peace, and what skills do you think are necessary in your context? Okay. So I'll give you a minute. Please pause the video and make some lists. All right, hopefully you paused and had a chance to work through and think through that for yourself in relation to your context. What I would like us to also think about is some personal reflection. So how do we as individuals learn values, right? If you take a minute and just write down all the educational spaces and educators who helped you develop your values, right? Where do you think those explicit and implicit spaces were? And, feel free to think outside of formal education, right? I would argue, I was a latchkey kid, which means in my Canadian context, as a young person who comes home after school and stays at home alone in the house. And that meant that I spent probably an unfortunate amount of time with the television, but I think I learned a lot from shows with strong female characters. I don't know how old most of you are, or if you're familiar with North American television, but The Golden Girls and Designing Women were very popular shows in the 80s when I was growing up, and they both had these strong characters that I think really influenced me. You can also think about maybe religious spaces, playgrounds, sports fields, maybe your grandparents' house or around the table or under a tree, right? But where did you develop your values? So once again, let's pause and think about, where do our values come from? Okay, so welcome. Hopefully you took a trip down memory lane and came up with some interesting things. Perhaps if you found something particularly meaningful, you might want to share it with us in the forum. So Dinesh has this concept of worldview, right? And that, really underlines his theory of peace education, which this is where peace education gets a little bit confusing. He calls his form of peace education education for peace. And that's his way of differentiating it from other forms of peace education. And yet, in a lot of contexts, the language that's used will be education for peace to refer to peace education in general. And there's all kinds of debates about that, and I'm not going to get into them, but just so that you're aware, that is a thing, okay? So Dinesh says that our worldview is subconscious, right? And it's automatically developed through our life experiences. So the role of peace education is to make that visible, broaden or develop creative options, and then allow for choice, okay? So historically, everything is normal until it's not, right? Slavery, gender oppression, LGBTQI oppression, right? These things have been accepted over time. But then what happens is that we have to make the oppression visible because it's been normalized, right? So it's part of structural and cultural violence, and therefore the direct violence is normalized and accepted, and so then we make the structural violence and the cultural violence that uphold that direct violence visible. Then we allow for more options in terms of and when we think about options, it's not just about ways of doing, it's about ways of thinking and ways of being, right? So, intersex people have existed throughout history, and statistically, they're 1 in 1,000 people. So that's a very large number. And yet, it's only recently that we're acknowledging that intersex is even a category of humanity, instead of just the biological binary of male and female, right? So that isn't even a creative option. That's a scientific fact that we've been ignoring, right? So then we have to open up our ways of thinking and then allow people freedom to be who they are and allow them freedom for choice. And that's a big part of what peace education is, okay? We can even think about this, politically, right? Since, I guess, Marxism, we've thought of politics as this left-right spectrum where you have communism on one end and then neoliberal capitalism on the other side, right? Well, why is it this linear? Why can't we think outside of the line? Part of peace education is thinking about what are all the other possibilities outside of just these two binary things or along this one line, right? If communism was only put into writing by Marx historically, oh gosh, I don't even want to say how long ago, then that's a recent construct. The binary of left-right is a recent construct. So what is the next construct? What is the next political idea? So we have to, as peace educators, break down these historical boxes that we built. And sometimes they're not even that historical, right? Saw a really interesting quote about capitalism seems like the unassailable structure that we'll never be able to change. And yet, isn't that what the divine right of kings was as well? And I found that really interesting because I'm engaging in those conversations right now around climate change. So a little off topic, but interesting. I hope you find it so as well. All right. So another activity, okay? I just want you to pause the video and take a minute or two to write down something someone does that annoys or bothers you. Maybe it's your professor going off topic in the video. That seems fair. So 1 minute, please pause, write something down. All right, welcome back. So just keep that at the side and we're going to use it a little bit later. So we did a little bit of reading about nonviolent communication and Marshall Rosenberg, who came up with this theory of communication. It's based in honesty and empathy. And then basically the goal of communication and the goal specifically of nonviolent communication is connection, both to ourselves and with each other, right? And then he talks about 4 steps: observation, need, feeling, and request, okay? The thing to remember about nonviolent communication is that the goal is connection, not to get what you want. So just keep that in mind, all right? So the first step, observation versus judgments, right? So observations are specific to time, place, and context. Judgments include assumptions or evaluations that may not be accurate and can sound like criticism. And judgments hinder connection, right? So if I say to someone, you're always late, versus you have arrived more than 5 minutes after we were supposed to meet 3 times this week, what the person hears and their response is different, okay? She's lazy versus she's appeared to not be doing her work in class 3 times this week and has not completed her homework 5 times in the last 2 weeks, okay? Generally, when someone hears an observation, they don't automatically get defensive. They start to reflect. Is that true? Is it true that it's been 3 times or 5 times or whatever the specific number that you've given us, okay? So observations leave space for empathy and understanding. So when you give the observation, the person can say, yes, I have been late 5 times this week. Unfortunately, my car is in the shop and I'm having to take the bus and I'm having trouble figuring out the schedules. Okay. That conversation leaves a lot more room for connection than the "you're always late" and then the person's automatically offended, and then they don't even necessarily want to explain to you what's going on in their lives, right? So you're breaking the possibility for connection. So looking at the sentence that you wrote 2 slides ago, I want you to see if your description of that situation, of the person that annoys you or bothers you, was it an observation or a judgment? And if it was a judgment, can you rewrite it now? So if you're rewriting it, remember that observations are specific to time, place, and context. So be specific, all right? So take a minute and do that. Right, so we'll move on now to talk a little bit about needs. You might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and to some extent, Rosenberg wants us to question that. And I think there is an argument to question it in that, yes, our basic survival needs are incredibly important, and yet, are they sufficient? So I would argue for most of the human population, if you put us in the woods or the jungle or whatever wild space it might be, with all the things that we need to survive, so food and shelter, clean water, right? And so that we could live reasonably well. But you didn't have any access to communication with other people or any type of entertainment. I think a lot of people would not survive that situation, right? And that depends a lot on other people's other needs, right? So people who have a strong need for connection would not survive in that situation because they need communication and affection. That's maybe different to someone who has, let's see, a strong need for inspiration or beauty, right? That might be something that they could get out of books. And sometimes you can get it out of the natural environment as well, right? That also might relate to creativity. So what if there was no way to write or create art? Maybe someone would struggle with that, right? So these other needs that we have, and that we all have in differing levels. He includes in physical well-being, sexual expression. Well, we know that there are many people in this world who feel that they are asexual, that they don't have a need for sexual expression. And then there are some people for which that's very high, right? So this idea that needs are not all universal and exist in differing levels. And in fact, those needs ebb and flow in different spaces, different contexts, and in relationship with different people, okay? But the idea is that, according to Rosenberg, everything that we're doing is in hopes of satisfying some need of ours, right? So I've got some feelings here. They're in 3 different categories, let's say. And I want you to try and think of what the titles of these 3 categories are. So you can pause if you'd like. But what would be, so in the blue sections along the top, what would be the titles of those 3 different categories? So give you a hint that they're related to needs. The first category there, we have feelings that we might have when our needs are satisfied. So fascinated, amazed, enthusiastic, right? That's when our needs are satisfied. The second category, feelings when our needs are not satisfied, furious, frustrated, jealous, okay? And then the final category, Rosenberg argues, are not, in fact, feelings at all. They're judgments. And they're judgments because if I say, I feel attacked, what I'm actually saying is you or they attacked me, right? Or I feel pampered. What I'm really saying is you or they pampered me, right? I'm making a statement about other people's actions and giving it a quality, either positive or negative, and not actually talking about how I feel, all right? So that's a really important distinction. And just as Rosenberg would encourage us to try to observe rather than judge when we're talking about other people's actions, he would also say that we should do that about our feelings. So we should try to avoid judging words that we as a society have sort of hidden as feelings. Okay. So finally, the fourth part here is requests versus orders. All right. A request clearly asks for a doable, concrete action without demand or coercion. So would you be willing to, would it be possible for you to, all right? And you want to be specific and give a time frame if it applies, right? So you're requesting action, but not personality changes, okay? And you have to keep in mind that everyone can always say no, right? So going back to our example of being late. In the next week, could you please plan to arrive 10 minutes before we are scheduled to meet to ensure that you are on time? Someone who hasn't been helping out around the house and I've called them lazy in the past. Would you please do the dishes 3 times this week before 8 p.m.? Okay. And by being specific about the time frame that you're requesting, you can clarify communication and sort of avoid frustration, right? I lived in a place where nobody did the dishes at night, and I was always the first one up for work in the morning, and there was never a clean bowl and spoon. And so I used this framework of nonviolent communication, and my request at the end was, would you please make sure at the end of the night there's at least one clean bowl and spoon so that I don't have to do the dishes the first thing that I wake up in the morning. And actually the people I live with were really sweet about it, and they made sure from then on. But it was, the time frame was key, right? Because they were doing the dishes. They just weren't doing them in a way that was helping me with my life. Let's put it that way, okay? So these making requests of people generally tends to get a better response than ordering people. Don't get me wrong, in situations of safety, like, stop, don't touch that. Obviously, those are shorter ways of caring for someone, right? And there's going to be moments where orders are necessary for safety. But as a general rule, when we're talking about communicating about non-urgent things, requests, according to Rosenberg, are heard better than orders, and then tend to increase connection between people, okay? So that's Rosenberg's 4-step process, right? So to give an example of what that might sound like in real life, I'll go back to the example of my housemates, actually. What I wrote was, when I wake up in the morning and there isn't a clean spoon or bowl, I feel sad because my need for smooth transitions in the morning is not met. Would you be willing to make sure that one bowl and spoon are clean before you go to bed, as the last people to bed? So, my need there, smooth transition might not have been, I'm trying to remember what I actually said, but the idea being that I found it frustrating in the morning, right? And so by expressing my feelings and my needs, they were able to connect with what I was feeling, and then that connection helped them to want to do that thing for me, right? Because the idea Rosenberg is saying is that we want to contribute to the well-being of others. That's a natural human thing. But because we feel connected to them and of a voluntary position. So writing the note that way, instead of like, do the dishes, probably helped me to be more successful in that situation, okay? And I just want to note about nonviolent communication that it's not something that's for always with everyone, necessarily, right? Because a big part of it is that you have to want to connect with each other. And if you're not interested in connecting, then it's a disingenuous process, and therefore you're not being honest and empathetic, and then it's not nonviolent communication. It can be manipulation, right? So we just need to be careful of keeping like the basic tenets of that. The goal is not to get what you want, but it's to connect with the other, and that it should be based in honesty and empathy always. So hopefully that's a tool that you'll find useful. Teachers I've worked with have found it particularly useful in their homes. Sometimes useful in the classroom, depends on the cultural context. But it's just another tool for your tool bag. Maybe there's parts of it that'll be helpful for you. Maybe there's parts that aren't. That's fine. It's just something else to think about, okay? So, final thoughts from Castro. She's giving some really clear examples there about being participatory and evocative, like this idea that we need to bring peace education out from other, not deposit it, right? Going back to Freire. So we bring peace education from the other, we don't push it into them, okay? And so some of the things that she talks about are things like place and space. How can you improve the space? How can you make it more inclusive? For example, cultural needs of the group, like Muslim prayer times or kosher food needs. In some cases, childcare, right? What are the things that you can do to make the space feel safer, healthier, happier, okay? And I want to point out there that this is actually really deeply supported by brain science, particularly with adults. Adult learners have a very hard time creating new neural pathways if they don't feel emotionally safe and comfortable. And actually a lot of this stuff in peace education that we're talking about in general, the more brain science research we have about education and teaching and learning, the more it's supported by that neuroscience. And so I'm learning about that stuff now. I'm really finding it fascinating. So maybe if you're interested in that, that's something you might want to look at as well. Okay. And going back to our basic ideas of what is peace education, right? The goals and objectives of the training or class should always be reflective of the group needs and context, okay? The goal is to interrupt the status quo, but coming from a space of working with people where they're at, okay? And we just need to keep that in mind. So I look forward to seeing you on the forum and hearing your thoughts and maybe your feelings, needs, and requests, okay? So take care till next time.